Welcome to Global Risk Community Chat. Today our guest is Lian van Oudheusden. I'm very happy to have you here today, Lian. Welcome.
Thank you, Izzy. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
Yes, likewise. So before we jump into the topic, can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
With pleasure. So, as you said, my name is Lian van Oudheusden, and I am an actuary and the head of model risk management at FirstRand Bank. So, FirstRand Bank is one of the largest banking groups in Africa. We have a number of different brands and subsidiaries. We operate across the African continent as well as in the UK. And notably, our retail branch, FNB or First National Bank, has won numerous awards for innovation in banking, both within Africa and globally. So my team at FirstRand is responsible in a nutshell for ensuring that when we make decisions off the back of models, and we do a whole lot of that, we're a very digital organization, that those decisions, whether they are fully automated or whether there's some human intervention involved, are robust because the models that they're based on are trustworthy.
Yeah. Sounds quite interesting. So thank you for sharing that with us. So let's then get into the topic. What would you like to talk about today?
So thanks a lot. So today I'd like to talk about managing the risk of bias in AI and machine learning models. So look, bias in models and decision-making processes supported by models is nothing new. It's something that's been around for a really long time. But in the context of AI and machine learning, what we're seeing is that the speed and scale with which such biases can be exacerbated is huge. So it's a much bigger problem than it was before and something that really deserves focus. But aside from the pure model risk, and when we talk about model risk, we're typically talking about the risk of financial losses that result from decisions that are made off the back of models that are not great. We also see other types of risk coming out of the process. A quick internet search, for example, will show you that bias in AI and machine learning models can lead to huge reputational damage for some really big names in the tech and financial services industries, amongst others. And then, of course, regulators across the world, really globally, are really focusing on AI and machine learning models and their usage and the implications of that usage. And so there's a lot of regulatory risk coming into the process as well. So while there are many technical elements involved in bias and detecting it and addressing it, I don't want to talk about the technical elements today because I really believe that addressing bias is not something that we should leave to the data scientists and not worried about. It's something that everybody in the risk management community should be aware of and should focus on and should play a part in making sure that we address appropriately. So that's what I want to talk to you about today.
Yeah, sounds actually quite interesting because indeed, as you mentioned, there's also a lot of risk aspect on this as well, and they should be all properly addressed. So then perhaps what are some key things to do when it comes, like being able to address this things properly?
Thank you. So lots of key things to do. We've only got about 10 minutes today. So I want to focus on 3 key things that I think risk managers should really know about and where they can play a role in addressing and assessing bias in these models. So the first thing of those is the first one of those things is understanding what bias is and defining bias in the context of your organization. Very important, not trivial, and not a purely technical process. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is just ensuring that when we address bias in models, there are again technical approaches that we can follow. There are various options, but there are trade-offs in the process. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what those trade-offs are and how we can make good decisions about the trade-offs that we would have to make. And then the last thing there, I'd just like to make a quick comment on the importance of making sure that when we set up governance structures and committees for helping to address and assess and challenge this bias, that we do so in a way that is robust and that's going to help us achieve what we want to achieve.
Yeah.
So, let me jump right in and let me talk about the definition of bias, really important place to start. So when we talk about bias in the context of AI and machine learning, we're really talking about prejudice or discrimination, right? And that seems fairly simple. We know what that is. We know it's not good, but it's actually not a trivial concept. It's not a trivial concept. And if you think about it, all models are actually built to discriminate. So whether we're trying to discriminate between a credit risk that we want to accept or one that we don't want to accept, or whether in the case of self-driving cars, we're trying to discriminate between an object that we can safely hit or a human life that we want to protect, models are built to discriminate. So we're not trying to avoid all discrimination. We're trying to avoid unfair discrimination. But defining fairness is also not a trivial thing. There are many different potential definitions of fairness that can be applied, and what definition will be appropriate will differ between different contexts. So most of the definitions of fairness that we do apply in this context hinge on one of two concepts. The first is individual fairness, and that talks about making sure that we treat similar individuals similarly through our model. So if everything about somebody, that everything relevant about two different individuals is the same, they should get the same treatment or the same outcome. The other concept is group fairness, and that's where we're talking about fair outcomes across different groups of individuals. So making sure that the outcomes on average for one group is the same as the outcomes on average for another group. And that particularly applies when we're looking at vulnerable groups or protected groups. And so, kind of conceptually, we would like to say, okay, well, let's optimize both of those things. But in reality, that's often not possible. So there's a lot of judgment that needs to be applied when deciding on the correct definition of fairness to apply, correct in inverted commas in this case, because there really isn't a right answer. You need to make an optimized answer. And there are a couple of important things that need to be considered in the process. So the first thing to know is that fairness definitions, and a lot of them can be expressed mathematically, and those are the ones we look at, but they're often mutually exclusive. So you might think two things are important, but it is literally mathematically impossible to achieve them at the same time. So you can't win everywhere, right? The other thing that's really important to consider, and again, where risk managers with a broad understanding of the different risks in the landscape can really play a role, is different stakeholder perspectives when it comes to assessing fairness, because different groups are going to have different views on what's fair. And so when we are selecting fairness criteria, we need to think beyond what's technical. We can't have a win on every angle. We need to prioritize things, and it's going to be very situation sensitive. So the answer in one case will not be the answer in another case. And what we really need to be able to do is look at different fairness criteria, look at how that plays out, look at how that impacts our stakeholder group, and make a very judgmental decision, a human judgment-based decision on what we consider fair and how we are going to implement that. So risk managers, I think, something to really focus on, something where you can really play a role.
Yeah, and I hear a lot of key aspects when it comes and this is only, like a few of them, and there's so much that risk managers should be, I think, considering. So since we're running a little bit out of time, I want to ask one last question, and that is, what would be the biggest takeaway point that risk managers already can start implementing? Of course, you've shared a lot of them, but if there was one thing they can immediately start with, what would that be?
So I think one thing they should really immediately start with is making sure that where we have governance, so no one individual should be responsible for applying this kind of judgment. We really need to do it through properly constituted governance committees. What I'd ask them to do is to make sure that those committees are diverse committees, that they contain different perspectives, that there's demographic diversity, that there's diversity in backgrounds and in disciplines and so on, so that when we tackle the problem, we tackle it from various angles, and that we don't have a single view in those discussions, because that's really what's going to be necessary to ensure that we apply good judgment and that we get the best outcomes possible.
Yeah, that actually, I think, is a very important aspect that I'm glad you shared about. So yeah, that actually kind of concludes our time for today. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today, sharing this crucial topic, because I think people really need to learn about this bias and the fairness, especially when it comes to, these emergent technologies like AI or machine learning models as well. So thank you so much for your insight on that.
Absolutely, nothing but a pleasure. Thanks, Izzy. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.